Whenever.
All right, let's talk about gasoline. The world's in a bit of a crisis at the moment. Assuming absolutely everything goes perfectly, it's going to be at least another 25 years until we've cycled out gas-consuming cars. In that time, we're going to consume another 2 trillion barrels of oil, at least. That's almost double what we've consumed since the oil age started in 1859. Now, in order to bridge that gap, we've got to find more oil. Now, in the US, there does exist enough. There exists 8 trillion barrels of oil in one spot. It's in the Marcellus Shale rock formation. It takes up a couple of states. However, the only way to get that out is via a process known as hydraulic fracturing, or fracking for short. The way fracking works is that they take a mixture of several million tons or gallons, either way, of water, mix that with sand and a special brew of chemicals, and then pump that into the ground in order to fracture the layer of rock. And from there, they can just pump out the gasoline. The problem with this is that the risks for hydraulic fracturing are very significant, and they are extremely poorly regulated. Now, in order to justify that statement, I have to explain 2 things. First, why it's dangerous, and second, why it's poorly regulated. As to why it's dangerous, the most obvious reason, and the most prevalent in all cases, is that the fracturing not only shatters the top layer, but it takes out parts of the bottom layer as well, and then the gas and the fracking mixture gets into the ground and into the groundwater. There was a documentary by a man named Joshua Fox. He lived in Pennsylvania, and he owned property that an oil company asked to lease for a fracking project. So he decided to do an enormous amount of research. And one of the particular things that he did was he visited lots of different towns that were on fracking operation land. One particular town, the leaking was really, really bad. The local animals had been poisoned. People could no longer shower or use their water to cook, wash dishes. In one particular case, a man turned on his kitchen tap, and let it run for a minute, and then he struck a match and he held it under, and it exploded into flame. Now, if we've come to a point where you can literally light your tap water on fire, something has gone wrong somewhere. And this kind of thing was not just confined to that town. Pretty much every single town that was on a fracking operation land area had the same kind of thing. Now, as to why it's poorly regulated, well, first and foremost, there's zero federal regulation on it. The 2005 Clean Energy Act was set up in order to try and present these things. However, fracking was completely exempted from all of its rules. It has no federal laws to keep it safe or clean. All of the regulation for fracking is done at a state level, and there just aren't enough resources to do that. As of last November, there were 125,000 oil and gas wells being tapped through fracking operations, and there was a grand total of 31 inspectors to look over all of these. Not only are there so few people look over it, but the penalties that are in place to practice safe fracking are just ridiculously poor. An average of $44,000 would be lost if companies reported their $44,000 per year if companies reported their mistakes accurately. However, that's less than half of the profits they make per day. So they really don't have any incentive to care about this kind of thing. President Obama tried to get on this. He created what's called the Natural Gas Subcommittee on the Safety of Shale Gas Development. The problem with this is that the committee has no actual lawmaking power. It can only make suggestions. And as long as there's enormous quantities of money to be made, I must ask, how well are suggestions going to change things? So at the end of the day, the companies are just left to self-regulate, and that they ignore that. They do whatever will get them the most amount of profit. So, it should be obvious at this point that hydraulic fracturing is potentially extremely dangerous, and it's in dire need of some very, very strict regulations on it. Thank you.
All right. The claim sounds like it has multiple parts to it, and in fact, the claim is the same thing as the preview, talking about the dangers and the need or the problems with the lack of regulation. So you really need that more general covering term to include them both in. The secondary issues, though, are pretty clearly labeled. It takes you a long time to define what it is that you were actually talking about. You spend almost 2 minutes kind of creating background and explanation on this before we get to the nature of the controversy. Internal signposting is clear and easy to follow, and you do a nice job talking to the audience and presenting it, trying to engage the audience while you're speaking. I appreciate that. The citation of the examples from the documentary is a little vague. You want to make sure that you cite the documentary and you give us direct quotes from it. For instance, the description of some of the events that happened in the one town, they certainly don't sound appealing, although there's not any suggestion that people have been poisoned or that anything exploded, except that the guy lit his sink on fire. And I guess he didn't even light the sink on fire, he just lit the water coming out of the sink on fire. So what you need to do is you need to find some information that suggests that this could in fact be, it could explode, maybe a town could blow up, or that people's homes are endangered, or for instance the exposure to the gases in the atmosphere do something to raise the levels of disease, or I don't want to say disease, but some kind of physical harm in those places where the fracking is taking place. We've got 125,000 wells that are doing this, so we ought to have plenty of experience on these kinds of leaks and these sorts of problems if they're the way that you've described. On the regulation thing, I think you've got clearer evidence on those points. You've got information that talks about the number of wells that there are, the number of inspectors. We don't get a source citation on any of that, and that's a little bit of a problem. So you want to make sure that you provide those sorts of things. All right, thank you.